Good evening, folks, the graveyard shift. I read an article yesterday which I'd like to kind of maybe start with, because I think it highlights exactly the story we're facing with climate change and the tourism industry. It's published in the Daily Maverick, and I urge you all to go and have a look at it. And I'm just going to start with how he introduced it. At some point in reporting on the climate crisis, it became perceived wisdom worldwide that we should dial back on the gloom, or people will turn away and ignore the climate change problem. Frankly, that's insulting. We need to tell it as it is. Humanity is running an ecological Ponzi scheme in which we rob nature and future generations to pay for boosting incomes in the short term. The fabric we call civilization is in danger of unraveling fast, now that you might imagine. And we're being misled by bullshit. If we don't stop now, we're screwed, and our kids will be further screwed. The science underlying these climate change issues is strong, but awareness is weak. It's time to take stock, because in comparison to what's coming to us, the Ukraine issue is a sideshow. And what he goes on to say, and he develops a very good argument, is that governments are incapable of changing the climate change, because they've got voting every 4 or 5 years. They've got health, they've got people to look after, and climate change is not going to get them the votes. What he's saying is it's up to us as individuals and as industries. And what my talk is very much about, it's us. Because if we look at what we've done in our generation, try and get this thing to work. Should I just go? But I think I need 1 or 2 images. And I think it's in our generation which a lot of this stuff has happened. And when you see what the tourism industry has done to the wildlife and to nature and to the planet, it's something which we as a generation should be highly ashamed of. Can you just keep moving it ahead? Just keep. Okay, have a look at some of these images, folks. This is what the tourism industry that we have created. Are we proud of this? This is what our generation has done to some of the most fantastic parks in Africa. Are we proud of this? This is our responsibility. How much hardwood is in each and every one of our houses? To the extent that places like Mozambique, Zambia, are being stripped of its teak, and places like the Congo and the Amazons are being slaughtered for their hardwoods. How much is in our houses? I went to a lodge the other day, actually 2 weeks ago, and there was rosewood being used, rosewood, the most highly endangered trafficked instance, being put down as decking in this particular lodge alongside teak. And yet we've got the solutions, as Harold was saying. We've got all these hydrogen type things. We've got rhino wood, which is made from the most commercially grown, fastest, softest, easily grown wood, and they can make hardwoods out of softwoods. Why are we persecuting the planet? And why do we put things like porcupine quills? Now I have to admit, and I have to be highly embarrassed when I show this photograph. This was from my home. And then 5 years later, suddenly we find that porcupines are being poached throughout Africa because of the demand from private homes like mine. And once I'd realized that, we made a point of making sure that none of our lodges had a single piece of environmental or an endangered species or even a wild species. Because once you start the pattern of consumption and you create demand, you go down the slippery slope. So it's highly embarrassing when you start seeing these things. And if you look at what's happened in our lifetime, in your and my lifetime, the amount of wildlife degradation and disappearance is between, on some of the 4 key species, is up to 95% of all the animals which were there when I was born are now gone. In my lifetime, and in many of your lifetime, this is what our generation has done. This is what our tourism industry has not failed to solve. And we haven't even taken into account what the next billion people are going to be living in. And if you look at this map, they're going to be in Africa. And unless we get our story sorted out very quickly, we're not going to have a tourism industry. We're not going to have a wildlife. We're not going to have biodiversity protected. We have to start changing now. And it's not all bad news. There is some good news. For those of you who know the hotspots theory, if we go and selectively choose the right 5 to 10% of the planet, we can protect sustainably 80% of the species remaining. You've got to be very careful, and you've got to make sure that you do these areas well. And things like rhinos. We're going to see extinction in the wild in our parks very shortly, our national parks, not necessarily private. And the government has made a huge turnaround, and in the next couple of months they're going to be introducing a white paper. Please support the minister. It's been 2 years of consultation with some of the best people around. But if we go and support harebrained schemes which are going to go and try and sell rhino horn to save them from extinction, it doesn't happen. Demand, we know for sure, for rhino horn has been 70 tons a year, and South Africa can produce 2 tons a year. We have to start looking at things. Thank goodness SATS has started the process to start looking at ways of cutting back the animal interaction for human entertainment. We've got to stop all these lion petting programs. We've got to go in and we've got to start handling wildlife responsibly. It's not just for instant gratifications for human beings. And I applaud SATSA for going down this route. And this photograph, folks, to me sums up everything. Heinrich van der Berg really has got this image. And the question going forward into the future, do these elephants walk through this village unhindered? Or because of the fear they've had before, do they go and smash people and kill people? Or do the people inside there get so worried about these elephants that they go and kill them? And the most important things, folks, is that we've got to start having big picture plans, which in particular bring in communities, which I'll get to. And it's not all bad news. If you look at this is Chad. Who would have thought that Chad is one of the finest wildlife destinations in Africa? If you go back nearly 20 years ago, there had 12,000 elephants in Zakuma. 10 years ago, they had 400. These elephants were so scared because the Sudanese horsemen used to come through and carve out 20, 30 at a time and slaughter them. They went from 12,000 to 400 in the space of 10 years. And yet African parks came in, and with dedicated people and working with the local communities, they've turned this thing around. It's one of the most successful stories of wildlife and people working together in harmony. And to give you a little anecdotal story of Chad, this is an Afrikaans-speaking fellow. His name is Rian Labaskachni. He was sent in there to sort it out. His first thing was to deal with local communities. These elephants, there was not a single elephant under 15 years old when he arrived there. And by the time he had left a couple of years ago, the elephants around his home had got to understand, and when they heard Afrikaans, they knew they were safe. To the extent he could put a hose pipe out there, and they'd come drink from his hose pipe, fresh water. Now you imagine the trauma those elephants had seen, and to the extent that they could go to his home and drink from his house pipe. And yet, if one of the other Arabic-speaking fellows came in and started speaking Arabic, the elephants ducked. And today, Chad is the most extraordinary story of success. So while it's doom and gloom, it's not over. And we as human beings have got to make sure that we make it work. And there's some wildlife heroes all the way through the planet. And for me, the Travel Channel can become one of those wildlife heroes if we start to behave responsibly. If we start supporting people who are doing the right things. And we channel business away from the pirates. And there are pirates galore, and we know them. And there's greenwashing galore. You've got to do your work, you've got to get in there, and we've got to start supporting the Travel Channel, because through money and supporting the right guys, we then in turn support the communities, and we make sure this thing works. But if we continue like we've been doing, the tourism industry is going to be the demise of wildlife and biodiversity in Africa. We are at that crossroads right now. And every year which goes further down the line, it gets worse and worse, and we need to wake up. And these folks have to be part of the solution. And we found out that when you bring in all the different generations, this is a photograph from Chad again. These school kids are going to school because of wildlife, because of conservation, and they're fully integrated. And we've all got to start having big, hairy, audacious goals, because when we have big, hairy, audacious goals, we can make things happen. It's not governments, it's us. Even things at home, doing small things at home, switching off your lights, switching off your computers, but have big, hairy, audacious goals. Pity we don't have Wilfred here. There's this whole movement outside and around Cape Town to secure the kelp forests and turn it into a World Heritage Site. When you see that and you put some money in there and support them. This little fellow here is the most understated guy on the planet. He's got a plant named after his family because he took the generation gap 30 years ago and made Grootbos happen. Can you imagine having a plant called Lutzerai? They've now found 7 new species of plant on what was considered to be an unimportant piece of fynbos. He took a big, hairy, audacious goal and he made it happen. And now the amount of people who are learning from is superb. We've got to have big, audacious, hairy goals. And it's all about the soils. Our industry is about soils. And the rangelands, in other words, areas which are really wild and have kept, grasslands, natural grasslands, contain far more carbon sequestered in the soils of rangelands than in tropical forests. We have to look after the rangelands. He does. The kelp forests do. So what is our big, hairy, audacious goal at Natural Selections? First of all, we want to take Mkombati, we want to make it 50% bigger. These grasslands we want to protect and increase. But the biggest one is the Okavango Delta. We are so fortunate to have worked there for all our lives. I arrived there as 1977 as a 22-year-old Mushimani. And it's been good to me. And we've decided we're going to go and do something really big and hairy. And what we've decided is that the Okavango is all reliant on what's happening in Angola. And if we don't protect what's happening in Angola, there is not going to be an Okavango. And what's happened over the last, 1974, there's been civil war. And civil war has surprisingly been the very best conservator, because people couldn't go in there. Now that civil war's gone, Angola's up for grabs. And when you travel through many parts of Angola, this is what you see. Chinese timber saws. The sawmills are coming in, they're taking rosewood, teak in huge numbers. And when you fly over, you see these little collections of hardwood being hauled out the forest. They haven't got to the east yet, to the source of the Okavango Delta. So we've got to make a plan quickly. So our big plan is we're trying to now get 1 million hectares of land conserved for posterity, so that the carbon can stay in the soils. And that's our goal. We might fail. We're probably, I'd say 50-50. We're going to get a good shot. And if we can do 1 million hectares, other guys can do 5 million hectares. And folks, this is where I'm going to end off. The generation that destroys the environment is not the generation that pays the price. Climate change is real. Governments aren't going to do. And I challenge the travel industry to be part of the solution, not part of the problem like we've created in the past. And folks, we've got to get this narrative of flying right. We can't be flight shamed out of. Africa has got to become the exception. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Colin. You've certainly raised the issues. Roland, your turn.
Yeah,
your
great.
PowerPoint is coming. Can somebody put Roland's PowerPoint up for him? Thank you.
Just while we're waiting for the PowerPoint to come up, I'll quickly just set the scene. I'm representing the African Nature-Based Tourism Platform, which is a global environment facility funded a program which will run over 3 years. And the initiation around that was really to support community-based tourism enterprises across 11 countries in Southern and East Africa that were severely impacted as the rest of the tourism industry, but in particular focusing on community-based tourism enterprises in conservation landscapes across these 11 countries in Southern and East Africa. So There are three components to this work. The first was really to be able to understand through a survey of enterprises what the actual impact was and has been and continues to be. So through our network of community-based natural resource management organizations in these 11 countries, we've been able to survey 650 enterprises. You'll be able to see on the map what the distribution of those 650 enterprises are. And significantly, just in that cohort, the jobs before COVID was 30,000 in those 650 enterprises, and is now at 13,000. So that's a very granular example of the impact of COVID just on a specific subsector. Is somebody, can I? So the main objective then of this platform is to facilitate access to COVID-19 relief and recovery funding for communities, nature-based tourism enterprises and conservation areas in southern and eastern Africa. And we've now developed a platform called NatureBased Tourism.Africa, which you would be able to access. And the key thing is that through this Global Environment Facility fund of nearly $2 million, we will be aiming at trying to mobilize and supporting SMMEs in these conservation landscapes to access $15 million worth of funding to help with their Build Back Better process, and more importantly, to build greater resilience in these landscapes. That picture then just indicates the 11 countries in Southern and East Africa where this project is being implemented. And our key focus areas are, so the project is being implemented by WWF US, and we have these 11 community-based organizations that are our key focal points. And it was through these community-based organizations that we reached the enterprises that were surveyed to be able to get this summary. I'll just show then just a snapshot of the survey responses that were received. And that just, the map of Africa then just shows each color is in a different country, and it shows the GIS location of where the enterprise was that was surveyed. And the amount of survey responses has increased subsequently. We're now sitting on about 650. And that's then where you can see this huge drop in employment. And that's a very important indicator of the real impact. And if we have most projections to go by that COVID, that tourism numbers will really only come back to pre-COVID levels maybe in 2024, 2025. There needs to be quite a significant focus on other sustainable livelihoods in these conservation landscapes in order to be able to continue to secure the natural capital that really underpin life in those and underpin life on Earth at the same time. And so this is then really a critical element of the resource mobilization, is to then also see what are the alternative livelihoods that are able to be supported in this interim, and that is then going to assist in creating then a more resilient community in these conservation landscapes. So the real value add that this program really has is that we'll be focusing very strongly in the next 2 years on connecting funders and investors to beneficiaries. So focusing very much on these 650 beneficiaries that have participated in the survey, and really focus on supporting employment and sustainable livelihood outcomes and achieving those kind of outcomes. linked with that is also then building long-term resilience of the nature-based tourism sector and really encouraging nature-positive development in these conservation landscapes, and obviously also linked with the nature positive is then also carbon neutral or even carbon positive. And these initiatives then are really looking at landscape level conservation and looking at aspects of potential access to resources around climate adaptation and alternative livelihoods. So just to give an example of some of the work that we've been doing with a few of the community-based organizations and the SADC Secretariat and an organization called Boundless Southern Africa, we were able to develop a concept note for the SADC Transfrontier Conservation Areas financing facility. And we're hoping to hear if that concept note has come through, and that would have a significant injection in supporting these sustainable livelihoods. There's also, for example, a facility called ICI, which is a German-funded international climate initiatives program. And recently we had a proposal writing consultant that went up to the Kenyan, to spend time with the Kenyan Wildlife Conservancies Association to work with them to develop a proposal for the current call for small grants of ICI. So the big gap is the lack of skills to develop proposals and the capacity and the energy to just keep plugging away at proposals and making applications and knocking on doors. And there's a lot of fatigue from enterprises and a lack of skill. And that's really a big part of the emphasis that is going to be placed on identifying different funding opportunities, trying to match those with different types of enterprises in order to be able to ensure that there's a more resilient build back better across the board, but importantly that it is also conservation compatible and is in line with frameworks that are also being developed. For example, at SADC level, there's currently a strategic framework for the wildlife economy that's being developed. In South Africa, we have a biodiversity economy strategy that is also really focusing on identifying and making more explicit benefits of biodiversity. Because unless communities can see that benefit, the value of maintaining that natural capital and maintaining that biodiversity is then also not a clear connection. And those are really key aspects that we'll be working on with our partners in these community-based structures throughout the 11 countries that we're working with. And the final element is then also a knowledge exchange. So, for example, within the community networks we've been working with, we've had case studies from Kenya and from Namibia, for example, on the successful conservancy models that are being deployed and structured in those countries. And those are then case studies that will be circulating more widely so that more people have an idea of the range of solutions that are out there, and being able to then take those and domesticate them and make them work in their communities and in their specific conservation landscapes. And so that's going to be a large part of also the work that we're going to be doing going forward in terms of then sharing those knowledge tools and getting word out about what are the pathways to accessing resources, but also not to externalize that an enterprise is always dependent on resources from elsewhere. Fundamentally, it is about an enterprise or a business being able to be self-sustaining in their business models, being also mindful of the triple bottom line around environmental responsibility, and really the triple bottom line around people, planet, and profit.
Thanks very much indeed,
Thank
Roland. Michael, you have the floor.
Phew. First of all, I have to agree with the communities and the Conservancy. I would like to pick on that, and then I'd like to talk to my mentor next door, because Colin's been in this industry long before I started and have always admired what he's done. And I don't know what scared the shit out of you when you always say the big hairy thing. What do you mean by that? What is big and hairy?
No, it's we need big, hairy, audacious goals. When they talk about BHAGs, companies have BHAGs, and BHAGs are the guiding light which help people to go, and you put out a big goal and you strive to it. And in this context, I think we all need to have our own personal BHAGs, big, hairy, audacious goals. We need goals there which are going to make a real difference.
Okay, maybe I must tell you a little story. So I thought it's better than to talk in a big whole context. We bought Grootbos in 1991 in Gansbaai, a little fynbos reserve, 120 hectares. And I was fortunate enough to employ a botanist who became my mentor. And in 1999, when we started our lodge in 97, he said we have to form a conservancy. Cut a long story short, there were only 120 hectares conserved. That was our little private nature reserve. Today we are talking 28,000 hectares under conservation in the Western Cape on the coast. Our biggest challenge, though, and I think this is what we are trying to say, is I think there's a big difference between communities in Africa, when I say in the rural areas, the ones that we are suffering of, like the Kruger Park, like us down in our area, are that we have an influx of people continuously into looking for jobs. So actually, we don't have communities. We have influx of people where the communities have broken down, meaning there's no pastor that's recognized, there's no teachers that you went to, your grandfather went to. These are people looking for jobs. And unless we take the children, that's where the education has to start. The education has to start in conservation with the children of, let us call it, the communities around us. So if we looked at, we have 2 schools in Gansbaai with over 1,200 children, and there is no conservation, there is nothing taught about conservation at all. Yet these kids are living in a township, and I think this is all around us, sitting right here where we are. We just have to look at Khayelitsha, Guguletu, Nyanga, not one tree, no birds, nothing. How can we expect that we build enclaves like conservancies without bringing in the people that will make the decisions in the future? So unless we in conservation, as taking the money to, of course, conserve land, we've got to take money from our tourists to educate the children of tomorrow. So we are thinking of starting a school for conservation. We already have our little green conservationists coming to us. And I think unless in the conservancy that we've got, we start educating people that cycling tours can be done, little lodges can be done, overnight tents can be done, guiding can be done. I mean, we were walking along the coast in Gansbaai the other day with a group of Joburg people, and I thought, why is there no guide? Why is there no one out of our township taking these people along the coast? You must remember our township is 2 kilometers from the coast, yet our children do not know the coast. So unless we change our perception, and I'd like to say it quite loud, I think Grootbos will be taken away one day from us. That's the picture that you had with these millions of people on Africa. Not because they want to take it away that it shouldn't belong to us. They'll take it away for space, for flower harvesting, for the wrong reasons, not realizing that tourism is the one, if we protect it, The tourism is making the money for everyone. And why? Because Europe has been destroyed. Why are we getting all the Europeans coming to us? Why are they looking at the open spaces? They cannot find the open spaces anywhere else than in Africa. You don't find lions anywhere else than in Africa. We are magic. Africa is magic. But the tourists can't just pay some tour operator somewhere. They have to leave their money behind in our operations, in the Volva dances of this today, of the natural selections, of the Grotbosses, of wherever it is. The tourist, if he wants to enjoy it, has to pay a premium. And the premium not going into our pockets, but going into the schools to educate the children of tomorrow. And I think each tourist would be prepared to do it if we sell it correctly and show the tourist what we are doing. This is, by the way, what Grotbos is doing. We raise 15 million a year on funding. We have 40 people in Grotbos working for the community and for the conservation, and they definitely, our money does not come from the GEF or other organizations. It mainly comes from our tourists. By taking our tourists and making them aware that their children will not see these places anymore unless they invest in our children. Thank you.
Michael, if I could just add to what you've just said, one of the things that always strikes me is that in Africa and in India, very rarely do those people who are displaced and bear the opportunity cost of the conservation of that land, very rarely are they enabled to go and see the wildlife that's there. They're locked out of it. And until we find a way of enabling them to have an experience of that wildlife and understand why it matters, it's going to be very hard to make the case for conservation. And that's an issue in Scotland and in England as much as it is in Africa. Unless I was there when the new head of Scottish Natural Heritage took up his job, his first speech to his staff was about the fact that if the people from the Gorbals were not permitted to get out into the wildlands of Scotland, those wildlands would not be there. It's a fundamental problem that we have to address. Does anybody have a question? Or are we all too tired? It's been a long day. Colin, do you want to have a final comment before we wrap up?
Yeah, folks, we are at the crossroads. And the tourism industry has the most extraordinary opportunity to be the greatest conservator ever. But we can also be the catalyst for extraordinary destruction. And we have to understand that. I remember in 2013 we published a book about the good, the bad, the ugly of the tourism industry. And there's been amazing changes for the positive because so many people didn't understand what they could do to become a real force for positive change. But I think from my side, the days are running shorter and shorter. If we don't, as an industry, really embrace change and focus on doing the right thing, and all this trivial animal interactions for cheap thrills, and these practices which we are overloading in environments, and we're trying to really have it as many people into an area as possible to generate cash in the short term. We've got to relook at everything. We do need to have areas where we have high densities, but those areas must be able to be well managed, like for instance Kruger Park on tarred roads. We've got to really think about this industry, and we've got to do some soul searching, because I don't think we've done enough. And I think we've come through COVID. We had a perfect opportunity. COVID actually could have reset everything. But I'm not seeing change. And I'm kind of worried. And I'm hoping inspiration like this fellow over here and many others can really take the tourism industry to new heights and then become the greatest conservator. Forget about the NGOs. The tourism, the private sector can do it. But we've got to start now.
Roland, do you want to have a final brief comment?
Thanks. Just having looked at a lot of the debates, the discussions, the negotiations at a global level, especially with the post-2020 global biodiversity framework that's being negotiated at the moment, and that's going to be the big Paris Agreement of biodiversity. A critical issue is around clearly articulating nature's benefit to people. We often look at it the other way around, but unless there is a value proposition that is felt at a homestead level, at an individual level, that value is not just perceived, but that it is felt, and that natural capital within which those communities live is valued, is recognized as capital, because capital should see returns for one's own generation and for future generations. And I think that is a really critical lens also to really consider what is happening at the moment. And one of the really interesting things coming out at the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiation level is also not having a fixation around conservation areas or protected areas, because that's only currently, we missed the target for Aichi of 17% of the globe under protected areas. Currently, there are discussions around 30% by 2030, but those negotiations haven't resolved yet. But what about the other 70%? And what about us taking responsibility in our daily lives around the full range of our footprint on Earth? And I think in that context also, sustainable land use in the other 70%, in our urban areas and in our working lands, is also critical. I'm not saying is more critical or more important or not, but so easily we create the polarities, and it's either this or either that, but it is a much more complex but also responsible thing that each of us is also needing to come to the party, and each sector in particular in the discussion of this context, tourism. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Roland. Michael, you have the last word.
If I don't have a glass of wine now, I'm not going to be sustainable. Have a good evening.
Michael, thank you very much for the closing. Thanks to the panel. Thanks to the people who stayed here until the bitter end. And thank you also, if I may, to the people who've made this possible. Thanks very much for the tech. Really appreciate it.